The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to today's webinar entitled Building Commissioning, a Risk Management Approach. My name is Billy Zadig, Manager Special Programs for APA. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. The webinar recording will be posted to the APA webpage under the Continuous Learning tab later today. Professional continuing education certificates are being offered for today's program. Those who indicated they wanted a certificate at registration and meet the requirements will receive certificates later this afternoon. All attendees are in listen-only mode. Please type your questions in the chat box and they will be answered in the order they are received. If we run out of time and we still have questions, please responses will be sent directly to the person asking the question by one of our presenters. At this time, it's my pleasure to turn this over to David Reynolds, who will introduce our speakers for today. David, take it away.
Thank you, Billy. Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. We are pleased to be here to present this educational session on building commissioning for you. I'll do some quick introductions for you. We've got Megan Kelly, a marketing specialist for Farnsworth Group, who supports us heavily on the commissioning side and helped put together this presentation. Myself, Dave Reynolds with Business Development at Farnsworth Group. I've been exposed to commissioning for about the last 14 years. Started when I was on active duty in the Air Force Civil Engineer career field, where we were doing recommissioning and retro commissioning on facilities out of an organization I worked for in Panama City, Florida. Then I moved into higher ed as the Associate Vice President of Facilities at University of Texas. Learned a little bit more, but I really got my graduate education in commissioning through the Farnsworth Group and the experts like Matt Kale, who you're going to hear from. Matt really enforced upon me and impressed upon me the importance of early engagement of your commissioning professionals. And I think in today's environment with the pressure on the construction crews, on the design crews, and especially in higher ed, the limited number of project managers and construction managers you have, that extra set of eyes and ears out there in the field is fantastic. And Matt's going to dive in for you right now and give you a great educational session. So Matt, over to you with your 20 plus years of experience in multiple sectors, higher ed, healthcare, commercial, municipal, you name it. Matt's touched a lot of different sectors and he knows this subject well. Matt, over to you.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Billy. I just want to take a moment to say thank you to APA for providing the platform here to talk about one of my favorite topics for sure. Dave for facilitating this, and once again, a big thank you to Megan Kelly, without who this presentation would not be possible because she put most of the visuals you're going to see together today. So thank you both for your support. Briefly, the agenda today is we'll just demystify kind of what we think commissioning is. It means a lot of things to a lot of different people. Then I'll walk you through our approach and process, and then we'll kind of wrap up a little bit about why are we doing this and what the value looks like. Okay, so what is this thing we call commissioning? So sort of the formal definition that I'm required to give is that it's a systematic process and it ensures that the building does what the owner wanted it to do. It's about a 40-year-old service line. It really came into its own in the 90s and early 2000s and is now kind of fully mature. And I think generally when I talk to people, it's pretty rare that people have not had some exposure to commissioning and are doing it almost on a daily basis on their projects. A lot of that value increase you saw really came as LEED became more popular and the requirements and how LEED defined commissioning sort of became a thing. That's really where you started to see the spike in the uptake. And you know, now we have state requirements, you know, for commissioning at a lot of different places where we work. And then also, you know, the renewed focus on energy efficiency and kind of being an advocate for operational efficiencies in the building made all of the growth in the service line very possible. So, but I always like to say after I give that formal definition that I actually really dislike the word commissioning because it means so many different things to so many different people. Also, I still can't type it correctly the first time. There's too many M's, there's too many S's. That's why a lot of us will just start writing CX quite often. But generally speaking, I think it's the confusion around what commissioning is. You might talk to an installing contractor and they'll tell you that they're doing their commissioning. You might talk to, a code official and say we're specifying commissioning in this way, and that can get to be pretty confusing. So I'll kind of define the perspective that we're coming from. So first of all, for me, commissioning, no matter what the size and shape of it is, it's always got to be focused on quality. That's where we're anchored. I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide here, but also, from my perspective, I really think it's best deployed from a third-party perspective. The commissioning agent really should not have any reporting structure except directly to the ownership group. That's probably the best use of the things that we can bring to the table. And then finally, we want to be, holistic partners to the owner and really supplement their own in-house expertise. So we know the owners are pressed just like construction crews and designers are these days, and we want to come in and be extra eyes, hands, and ears, just like Dave mentioned at the front. So again, I mentioned our focus on quality, and many of you who manage projects will be familiar with the project management triangle, schedule, budget, and quality. And, a lot of focus gets put on schedule these days. We need these buildings when we need them. A lot of focus gets put on budget, obviously, with the pandemic and rising costs and, the pressure on factories to produce more, the budgets are having to be stretched further and further these days. And those things get talked about a lot. So we kind of take it as our, we have to put our quality hat on these projects. And while we understand that you certainly have to, pay a lot of attention to schedule and budget, if you don't put the right amount of focus on quality, it will sort of drag that leg of the triangle towards it. So that's why I like to talk about it in terms of good, fast, cheap, pick two. And our job is to make sure that we're balancing that good side of that equation and making sure everybody understands that as the project goes through decision making processes, value engineering, scheduling decisions, vendor buyouts, and things like that, that we want to make sure that we're understanding and providing full transparency around what these decisions mean for the project, and that we're still maintaining what that owner wants as far as the owner's project requirements go. Just to kind of go back to the idea of what are we talking about with commissioning, I decided to include a slide here that breaks this out a little bit, because depending on what part of the industry you're in or what you've been exposed to with your experience, you might have a very different definition of commissioning. So all the way on the left of the slide is code minimum commissioning, and all the way on the right is mission critical. And these are sort of the four tiers where we generally put stuff into. So, code minimum can be performed by anybody. It's defined by codes. You could have your contractor do this style of commissioning for you. And on the inside of the industry, we call this the check in the box style commissioning. There's only a construction phase, and you only have to worry about HVAC and hot water if you're just going to try to check the box and meet code. Then there's sort of the what does LEED require? This could be any rating system too, if you're chasing green globes, or down here in Atlanta, Georgia, where I'm from, we have the Georgia Peach program. Whatever your sustainability rating system is, that can sort of be defined here. You can insert that for LEED. And that's just going to be defined by those requirements. And they're pretty well understood. It's very easy to communicate around what those requirements are, because there's a standardized source of truth for folks to go back to and know what that scope looks like. Then there's sort of this big area in the middle where we call this owner's commissioning. So it's a little bit more intense than just what's required by whatever rating system. It's certainly more intense than code, but it's generally just defined by the individual owner and what they find valuable, what systems they want in there, and what level of support they're looking for. And a big part of the rest of this presentation is going to focus on how you size that effort and how you make sure that you're putting your resources in the most effective places and managing your risk in a way that makes sense. And then finally, on the right-hand side, mission critical, this is most popularly described in terms of data centers building, but it certainly applies to other stuff. But this is like the absolute most intense effort in terms of commissioning. Generally speaking, it takes a lot of oversight from the owner, meaning they probably have a team of qualified commissioning people, on the owner's group already, who just need support and boots, and they already know what their process looks like and exactly what kind of results they need. So that certainly gets a little bit more intense than just our standard, what we would call owner's commissioning. So from a process perspective, I think really every activity that we do in commissioning kind of goes into one of these 3 steps. The first step is this quantification and planning. And this is really where we start to talk about what are the risks to my project, what are the risks to success, and then putting those in order, making a rank and saying, hey, I really, for this particular application and on my campus, my electrical commissioning and my electrical systems are a bigger risk than my plumbing systems. And being able to have those honest conversations up front, because again, that's going to help shape and deploy where you put your risk management controls. And then once you have that exercise done, moving into the inspection is let's take that information that we know about and then start doing inspections. These are your pre-construction and your during construction type of activities where you're now going out and sampling the building at some rate and saying we need to assess the risk that this system is not going to be installed correctly and that it's going to cause some bad result on the back end. And then just start honestly talking about that and identify what that means for your campus and for your building and for the success of the project. And then finally, as you get that data out in front of you, we now have response monitoring. So we identify an issue early, hopefully, and then we have to decide what we're going to do about it as a team. And then we should also really be keeping an eye on, how effective we are, and then gauging our responses and our monitoring and control activities to make that as effective and make it more effective over time. So that was the academic version of it. But again, I think the simple version of it is, I think everybody here would agree that if you flip a coin 10 times and you land on heads, it doesn't mean that that coin is going to always come up on heads or that heads is the most likely result or anything. It just means those were the results you observed. And you probably didn't flip the coin enough times to get it to where we all know it is 50%. And so really, as this graph shows, that you really, to get a high level of confidence in what that really means, and we all know that the number is 50%, which is what I'm using to illustrate here, you need a big sample size. But how big is that? Is 100 really a big sample size? Does that apply to your project? If you installed 100 panels in a new construction project and looked at 10 of them and 10 of them were good, does that mean the other 90 are good? Maybe. And what does that mean in terms of the risk to your project if they're not? So this is the more complicated version of that same idea, where what we're really trying to do when we talk about how much of the building to sample is to get the result into that rectangular area on the left you notice as acceptable quality region. We want to make sure that the owners are accepting the right amount of risk, that construction professionals are accepting the correct amount of risk, design professionals are accepting that, and kind of find that Goldilocks zone of everybody having skin in the game, but not overdoing it and not saying we have to look at everything all the time, because that's just going to take forever. That's going to put your schedule at risk, and it's probably budget prohibitive. So again, finding that balance is kind of the art of sizing the scope. And then again, commissioning is not exactly quality control. We do a lot of quality control things, but what we really are doing is standing on the outside like this fellow here and documenting that the quality control activities are happening and that they're effective. So what are we really? We're actually quality assurance. And that's more of a process-oriented type focus, whereas the quality control really looks at that final product. Quality control is specified very clearly, usually in your contract documents. There's an entire section there that says, generally your general contractor or your construction manager, depending on your delivery method, is responsible for the quality of their subcontractor's work. And they're looking at that, and there's an entire process there that requires them to be doing that. Commissioning is then, from the owner's perspective and as a partner to the owner, sampling that, verifying it, and finding places where it could be improved or that it's happening really well, and just making sure that we document that along the way. So I just included briefly some systems that are likely to be commissioned on your projects. Everybody's familiar with MEP systems. That's pretty standard. We're also seeing historically a lot of this, and it just continues to grow. More and more owners are interested in the commissioning of their building enclosure systems, roofs and windows and so forth. Fire alarm, network access controls, medical gas, all of these are systems. So I think the interesting thing to highlight here is, systems that aren't on this list, and why are they not on this list? And just the general knowledge of commissioning. Well, because they're probably not risky systems, or they're less risk. So for instance, you wouldn't see commissioning for a sidewalk because, well, if the sidewalk cracks or isn't straight, you take the sidewalk out, put in a new one, and it's not a lot of cost, and it's clear who's supposed to do it, and there's not going to impact a lot of other trades in most cases. But all these other ones they're loaded toward the end of the project. They get very complicated and expensive. There's an extreme risk to the owner for all kinds of operational problems if any of these systems don't work well, and they don't work well immediately at turnover. And also, just to cover my bases here, I'm gonna talk mostly through the context of new construction commissioning today, but a lot of what I say can just be kind of refocused and applied to existing buildings. But retro commissioning and recommissioning are two different versions of existing building commissioning. Retro commissioning is commissioning a building that exists that has never been commissioned before. And recommissioning is taking a building that's already been through the commissioning process and then doing that process again later, going back through your tests and back through your verification at some spot in the life cycle. And then finally, the new kid on the block is monitoring-based commissioning. This is sort of finding creative ways to leverage the great software and innovations that we have today to train algorithms to do a lot of the more data-based or mundane tasks that traditionally a commissioning agent would do. So any one of those can be applied together. Monitoring-based works great with retro applications as well as new construction. And your new construction process should include some planning for recommissioning as well. So all of these kind of work together, but I wanted to define a few of those terms. And then finally, again, we put the focus here on holistic. We're not going to focus too much on any one system today, because as good as your control system might be, like you see on the left here, it really doesn't matter how complicated that is, how well labeled it is, how well it works, or how obvious it is to the occupants what to do to make the thing colder. It's not going to matter at all if your building envelope looks like this. So that's why we try to always talk about the project in terms of one final product that's being delivered to the owner. It's one wrapped gift at the end that all has to work together. And we really try to put our focus on, being that builder style mentality, not a specialist, having some expertise and a deep dive on whatever it might be, but also having some knowledge in all the other trades so that we can bring solutions to the table as a team. All right, so going through the approach and process of how we actually get this done. The first thing that's required and that we do all the time is get engaged early, like Dave mentioned, and then we really need to write down a plan. We need to say, what does the plot of this project look like from beginning to end? We'll start with the very basic steps, the owner's project requirements, and a basis of design, which I'll go into a little bit more in a moment here. And then really, as commissioning is best applied, we should really have that commissioning agent involved all the way through that first year warranty, and even maybe a little bit longer sometimes, to make sure that all the stuff that comes up during that first year of operation gets picked up, and we end up with a good building going forward that operates as expected. And as we get that plan on the table, again, giving a nod to schedule here, our goal as we implement our commissioning plan should always be to have a shift left mentality. We really want to push as many quality activities as we can toward the left of the schedule. We want to do things as early as we can and get that quality mindset into the front of the project and give everybody a heads up, that something needs to be fixed, or we need to revisit the design, or something needs to happen here. The traditional model is more, we kind of wait till everything is done and ready, and then we have a flurry of activity at the end and test things and notice issues and try to get a bunch of stuff done. And that, can really put your schedule and budget at risk at the last moment here. So our goal is always to do these things as early as possible and get that detected early. And really, that should overall keep everybody in a really good place with the project and make that deadline and turnover a lot more meaningful. So I promised to define these real quick. The owner's project requirements is an informal set of goals, can take a lot of different shapes and forms, can be very long, can be very brief, but just an honest accounting of what the owner thinks a successful project would look like, and it's documented and written down, oftentimes by the commissioning professional, but doesn't have to be. Will usually help and have that. And then what that gives us is again, it gives us that source of truth to go back to and say, the owner on this project said, I only want light switches. I don't want any occupancy sensors unless they're required by code. Maybe that's a thing. We write it down, and then as we get into construction, we notice, hey, we really prefer to have a switch here as opposed to an occupancy sensor, and that becomes, part of the project's requirements. We do document it, and we definitely manage it. Once that document is developed, that's sort of the formal response to that is then the design professional's basis of design. So that should then be a much longer, more detailed and complete accounting of how you respond to the owner's project requirements in a formal way. This contains all kinds of things like, here's what our HVAC system is going to be. It's going to be an air-cooled chiller and 10 air handlers, or a generator and an automatic transfer switch and some distribution panels, right? Or, a TPO roof. They should always, the basis of design should also include a complete accounting of what the codes are going to be that dictate the requirements of the project. And then a ton of detailed results that fall out of the programming exercise. How many seats do we need in this classroom? How many classrooms do we need in this building? And is that meeting the needs of the different stakeholders, departments that we're trying to satisfy with this project? The owner's project requirements can also have a lot of different other things in there. It could have, any kind of elements of ASHRAE or the International Code Council, sometimes the governing bodies like the Board of Regents of your state, NFPA. I've often seen just, lessons learned from previous projects end up in there. Like, hey, we really learned that we always want 80 mil roofs, right? That's just the thing that we want, so we put it in there. It doesn't have to be in any specific shape or form, but the idea is just to get those ideas out. And then as you have them documented and you keep track of them throughout the project, we're constantly going back and checking it. As we do a design review, the most often form of a design review comment that we get is, hey, owner's project requirements say, I only want light switches, not occupancy sensors. And I noticed that there's, some occupancy sensors over here. We're checking that during design, and that's not that you can't put an occupancy sensor or that it doesn't meet code or whatever. It's just, hey, the owner said this is what makes a project successful, and we want to make sure that that's what we're getting. Likewise, in construction, I kind of already gave that example. We'll go back to the OPR again and again and again. And by the way, that OPR is a living document. If we all of a sudden get to the middle of the project and the owner says, you know what, I've changed my mind, occupancy sensors are okay now. We go back and we update it and we change the philosophy going forward. But we track that and we have a decision tree and a reason why it changed, and we all understand what the philosophy is. And that helps us quantify the costs and any risks to schedule and budget that come as a result of that decision. And then finally, as you get to the end, the owner's project requirements kind of gets solidified. And then in the best case scenario, you can turn that OPR document back around into sort of a facility standard and say, okay, the next time we build something, we were pretty happy with this, we're going to start with this. And that becomes a circular process of quality that feeds back into itself and lets you get better and better with every project that you undertake. I'm going to dive into some more practical examples here of how we apply this approach on some real projects here. I'm going to try to go across all the different trades here and talk a little bit about every one of them. So hopefully everybody gets something for whatever your specific expertise is. One example here, this is on a laboratory project up outside of Chicago. The comment was, we noticed that there was a very long run of piping. That corridor that you see going off to the right there under the 95% CD design review comment goes off for 150 feet in that direction, and there was no isolation valve at this end of it. So we said, hey, it's not required by code, it's not in the OPR anywhere that we can see, but if I was the facilities management person running this place and there was a leak in that pipe, it sure would be nice to be able to turn it off right there without having it only have 100 feet of pipe leak instead of 250 plus everything attached to that equipment. So we went ahead and added that, and then during construction, it turns out they did have a need to isolate that pipe there to run some taps for somewhere else, and it was great. They were just like, hey, we got valves right here. We'll just go ahead and tap in and be able to isolate it, and nobody has to do any extra work. It was thought of ahead of time. So that's the kind of thing we're trying to do in terms of improving operational efficiency. And that's a really good thing for a commissioning professional to be focused on. You know, one of our most effective tools once we get onto site and things are being built is this first of a kind review. The idea here is that if we're going to put in 100 VAV boxes on a project, we're going to really advocate for, let's do one exactly right and get everybody to sign off on it. And then as the installing contractor spins up their effort, they have one to always go back to and look at and say, everybody signed off on this. The owner's facilities folks came out and signed off on it. Commissioning signed off on it. The design professional said it's good, that's what we want, it meets all the plans and specs. And that really lets them proceed fast and with confidence and know what good looks like. So we really promote that in a lot of different ways. Anytime you're going to have a large number, that helps control the sample size I was talking about earlier, is if you can do your first of a kind reviews and say, hey, everything you put in is good as long as it looks like this VAV box, that really helps, you know, make sure that everybody is clearly communicated to, and there's not a lot of callbacks or questions late in the process after 20 or 30 things have been installed, and there might be differences in every location. We also really like to advocate for the use of performance mock-ups on building envelope systems. This is an example from the California State Capitol building. They're actually going to build an annex on the back here. That'll be a legislative office building. And there's going to be a very tall, very unique storefront, or excuse me, a curtain wall system on there. And this was actually an example of where we built the mock-up offsite at a factory. And we used the actual contractors who were going to install it, sent them to the factory, built the thing with the real products, set it all up. And then they, in this case, because it was very tall, we used an aircraft engine to create the equivalent of hurricane force winds and water hitting the outside of that enclosure. And then you can see we documented some places where bubbles came through around the gaskets, the seams, and the attachment methods. And we were able to shore those up so that when they go to build this, there's absolutely no question about what the products are, what's going to be successful, and what good looks like. So again, this is all done well ahead of time, and that way you don't end up with several installed windows that we go to do this test on again later, that hopefully there's no failures, right? So we'll absolutely advocate for that on every project, building something ahead of time to give everybody some practice, to stage the materials correctly, to get an absolute eagle eye on how we're going to test this stuff and what compliance is going to look like and how it's going to be documented. I'm going to jump into another case study. A good use of the commissioning professionals you might engage with is to kind of find the spaces between the trades where there's a lot of time. Well, this person over here is got, you know, the below grade waterproofing scope, and that contractor is going to produce shop drawings and install it. And then this person over here is responsible for the below slab vapor barrier, you know, the Stego system, the yellow plastic you see installed under a slab. But in this case, what we noticed during the shop drawing review was that those two people hadn't really coordinated and hadn't thought about each other. And although there was the below grade waterproofing system was terrific, there was no real way to tie that into the below slab vapor barrier. So the commissioning recommendation was, as you're putting in the black product down there, which is the below grade waterproofing, let's go ahead and put a tail of yellow vapor barrier there, so that when we backfill this and then go to pour the slab on top, we can just put the other vapor barrier in and then tape them together, and now you have two systems turned into one. It's one continuous system. So this is the kind of constructability and shop drawing review and observational, you know, skills on site that your commissioning professional can help you with. And if that's not something that's, if you're not a person who thinks a lot about waterproofing or that has a focus on that, I always like to sum this one up by saying it's a really bad idea to tuck your raincoat into your underwear. There's also a whole lot of other, quality control types of activities that can happen on projects. I've listed a few of them here on the MEP side, torque testing, Megger testing, or on the electrical side of things, is your bus bar properly attached? Do your breakers trip when they're supposed to? Are the piping seals tight enough? Do they hold that vacuum overnight or over a couple of days? Does your ductwork leak? All right, did all the seams get sealed properly? These are just a ton of different, optional, sometimes specified, sometimes not tests that can just, again, go at managing the risk to your project. Likewise, there's a whole bevy of other envelope tests that you can have specified and have on your projects and may have had experience with. Two of the most popular are the AMA 501 and the ASTM E1105. On the top left there, you'll see the gentleman with the spray rack there who's testing the installation of that window system. He's doing it with a calibrated spray wand, so he has the right amount of water, the right amount of pressure at the right distance and over the right amount of time, with the commissioning authority on the inside observing to see if any water comes through. Now that's a different test than what you see on the bottom right, the ASTM E1105, which is where you actually build a, usually out of 2x4s and plastic, a chamber on the outside of the window, and then negatively pressurize that. This chamber goes on the inside of the window. And then the gray apparatus you see there in the middle actually negatively pressurizes that chamber, and then we spray water on the outside. And this is similar to the jet engine photo I showed earlier, but we're simulating hurricane force winds on the outside of this installed window application. So these are two very different tests, a lot of different levels of effort here. And again, deciding between these tests and how many of them to do over time is part of that risk management exercise. How much commissioning do we want? How much testing do we want? How many times do we need to flip the coin before we feel like we've got a product that meets the intent? A couple more examples here. These are two tests that are focused on similar systems, but they're very different tests. On the left is ASTM D4541, where we have put an epoxied puck onto the substrate material to make sure that the adhesion is happening and that the pull-off strength is as specified and the product performs. And then on the right-hand side, this is the ASTM E1186. And basically, we're trying to check the effectiveness of that air barrier. If it were to fail, bubbles would potentially come up. So we're doing that at a calibrated pressure and with instrumentation that we know is correct. So, two things on similar products, but with, testing very different things. So I just ran through only maybe a half a dozen or a dozen different kinds of tests that you could do on your building to increase the quality and reduce the risk. And these tests and the way that they're specified are spread out over different trades, and they're spread out all through the specifications on your projects. So again, how does the commissioning agent help with all this stuff? Sometimes we do these tests, we'll physically perform them. Sometimes we'll engage with a partner that does the test and manage them. But the best use of your commissioning professional is to have them with all this stuff in front of them, and then organizing it and putting it into something, like what you see here on the screen. We do this on every project where we're saying, here's the test, here's the system, where are we going to do it, when are we going to do it, how many times are we going to do it, and who's responsible to execute it and document it. And getting all that stuff organized into one place, sort of pulling it out of the specifications and pulling it out of the owner's project requirements and getting it into one easy to use document really helps. If we are going to use sub-consultants, getting them scoped correctly, getting them the right amount of testing visits and mobilizations and so forth. Your commissioning professional should have this in their plan and should have, an organized idea of when these people need to be mobilized on site so that people can get in and get out, and you can communicate with the installers and trade partners and the construction team, when they need to coordinate with these folks, when they need to provide power and water and all the different things that need to happen to make these tests useful and successful. So we talked a lot about what good looks like in tests, but when we talk about testing things, the matter of fact is that at some point something is going to fail, and your commissioning authority's responsibility should be to have already talked about that before it happens. You don't want to be talking about what we do now after a test fails. You want to already know what the plan of action is. So this is an example for one of our projects, and it also is nice because it shows another different possible quality control test. So this is an ASTM C1193 test, and the concept here is we're trying to determine whether the joint sealant you see there is correctly adhered to the sides of that EIFS system. And so the tester has marked it off correctly per the test, and they cut loose on the top, and then if it's adhered correctly, the sealant should break off where I have the red square on the middle photograph there. That's what a successful test looks like. In this case, as the contractor, or excuse me, as the testing agent pulled it out, you can see it went right past the break point. So, that becomes a failed test. Now, what do we do with that? So first of all, we have to figure out root cause. So why did it fail? Did it get installed improperly? In this case, we chased it down to that particular sealant product was expired when it was installed. But luckily, this was on an in-situ mock-up, and it was the first time we did it, so we caught that early in the process. The installing contractor got rid of all that old product, got some new product, put it in, we retested it, and everything was great. But if we hadn't had that testing procedure, you could have had this situation going on kind of all over a building, which would have been less than desirable. So when we fail, there should be sort of this process already in place. And keep in mind, as we walk through this decision tree, decisions on the left of the chart have less risk to cost and schedule, and decisions toward the right of the chart increase the risk to cost and schedule. So again, we're trying to balance that triangle between all these different things and make sure that we're getting the right size samples, the right level of interaction, and still getting the results we want. So generally, the first question you say, like, okay, here's a system. Do we need to test 100% of it? And if the owner says, nope, we're testing 100% of everything, that's the only thing that I'm comfortable with, that's the end of the story. We scope it out that way, and then everything gets tested, everything gets looked at, and that's it. And it takes a long time. It can generate a lot of issues. We just have to plan for it properly, and it certainly can be done. But if we're trying to fit into a tighter budget or a tighter schedule, we have to accept that's a lot of risk to those other things at the sake of quality. However, if we do make the decision, say, no, we don't need to do a 100% sample of everything, then we say, okay, well, how many unique installations exist? How many different window types do you have in the building? That's going to define a number of pools that you pull from. Then you say, okay, so we have 7 window type A's and 14 window type B's and 106 window type C's and so forth. And then your A, B, and C becomes these pools. Then you say, what's the pool size? Usually that's something between 7 to 10. And if the more risk you're comfortable with based on the system, then the bigger that pool size can be and the less individual tests we have to do. Then the process is, okay, now we have a set of pools and we have a size of pools. And we're going to go to each pool and we're going to test one installation, maybe in the pool A, right? If that passes, then we can safely say that the entire pool of window A types pass, and we're good, because we're going to say that in this case, we're trying to optimize for schedule and budget. If we're confident that if one window got installed correctly from pool A, the other ones are good. Now, again, back to the point, if that first installation fails, okay, well, first we're going to fix that installation and then retest it. That's number one. But we're going to go back to that same pool and then grab another sample, right? So back to pool A, and we're going to say, all right, we're going to test one more window similar here. Now, if that passes, if the remediated version of the first sample passes and the second sample passes, then we say, okay, we've got enough confidence to proceed to calling that pool A passed. Now, this is where it gets to be tough, and you have to think about this in the schedule. But if that second installation also fails, generally the process then is we're going to say, all right, we need to go ahead and test every single installation of A, because now we're into a situation where we don't have a ton of confidence in the way that got installed. And we're going to go through and verify that every single one of these places is correct. And generally the way we'll cover that is in the commissioning specifications. This will sort of be coded in and say, if we end up having to go back and do this, then more than likely that's, we're going to ask for some consideration from your construction manager or your installing contractor to say, hey, you did your quality control on this, but it turns out we found some things. So, generally speaking, we're going to have to go back and retest a lot of things, and we'll have to have a conversation about that. So I hope that makes sense in how you kind of apply all the different things I've talked about into a risk management process here, and then help size your risk appropriately. I would be remiss if I didn't, as I kind of wrap up the end of the content here, talk a little bit about the empowerment of operations and maintenance teams. I think that these O&M teams that run big facilities and campuses, these guys are, in my book, the same as first responders, police and firemen. They're the ones that keep the power on, the lights going, the learning environment going, and they have to be empowered. There's not enough of them, and we really got to do everything to make their job easy as we're building these buildings. So, the way that we try to help with that is a ton of training. Usually by the time you get to the end of a new construction project, you'll have a couple of very dug in, intelligent people that know everything there is to know about that building because they just got done building it, or writing the controls programming, or running the project for the entire time. And we really have to mine those people for information and have a good, long, well thought out handoff to the people who are now going to run it for the life of the building for the next 50 years. We need to get great turnover and documentation. We need to capture all that data that comes out of the construction process. We need to hand over systems manuals. We need to basically do everything we can to make these folks' jobs easy, because they're going to be hard no matter what happens. So we really advocate for a ton of commissioning-led training, and for commissioning really having a close eye on making sure that knowledge transfer process is effective. A couple slides here before we wrap up, and then we'll take your questions. So, why do we do this? What are the benefits? I talked about it a little bit at the front, but I wanted to give some more nuanced information here, coming from somebody who's been doing this for a while and things that I've seen. But, obviously we want to capture energy savings like I was just talking about. We got to document the construction process well and make it useful once we get all that stuff. It makes your occupants more productive if you have better things like indoor air quality and things like that. These are not opinions. These are backed up by a number of studies. Ensuring that you're getting the performance out of whatever system it is. If you bought a high performance building, you expect to have low utility bills. So making sure that actually happens. Improving thermal comfort. Just in every aspect, right? Air speeds and, glare on desks and the right amount of glare control and natural lighting, having that balance just right. And I think, interestingly enough, as I mentioned, the commissioning service line is sort of fully mature. I think at this point, of course, we're still growing, but people are much more comfortable with it than they were 5 or 10 years ago. And despite that, as a commissioning provider, we're actually, as an industry, reporting higher profitability. And there's the suggestion from the data that, commissioning authorities are getting better as time goes on. And we're able to do more with less because there's lots of tools at our disposal. There's a ton of studies. There's now entire generations of commissioning professionals who've all done nothing but be a commissioning person. And so that's really helping with the service line as it grows. And you can kind of see down here at the bottom, there's a little bit of data and a link to where this came from, peer-reviewed, properly done study, what the payback looks like on existing building construction and new building construction. Again, all this data just basically says, the cost of this is, generally speaking, going down relative to the cost of construction. That could also mean a more competitive market. More people are offering commissioning services, right? And the quality of product people are getting is going up. And even so, even with lower fees and all that stuff happening, commissioning providers are still able to do this profitably and still able to run a business model based on all these things. So I thought that was kind of an interesting study. So finally, before we wrap up here and take your questions, what I wanted to give you here is kind of, if I can sum this up on one slide. On the left-hand side here, you have a Google Maps of the city of Dallas, where we've just pulled in all the traffic happening right now, and you can see it's bad. It's number one, it's confusing. The highways down there have a lot going on. This is at 5 o'clock, so there's tons of red and yellow roads, meaning don't go that way or you're going to take a really long time. There's one-way traffic. There's all kinds of stuff going here, and it takes a lot of information and a lot of data gathering and a lot of people working hard to get that live data pushed onto the web, but none of it's useful in this format. It just tells you that Dallas is kind of a mess at 5 o'clock, like most big cities are, right? So what I'd like for you guys to take away from this is to think about commissioning as taking all that same data and turning it into something useful, like a navigation app. All I want to do is, how do I get home? And show me the most efficient way to do that. So can we get all that data down into something usable like a navigation app? And if we're able to do that effectively, then you guys will all probably want to do what I do, which is as soon as I turn on my Apple Maps or my Google Maps to go home in the afternoon, I just say, that thing says I'm going to be home in 20 minutes. No, I think I can do it in 18. So with that, we'll wrap up and take any questions from the audience.
Thank you, Matt. Well, our first question is, and I think this is for David, people would like to know if the presentation will be available to the participants today.
It will be. I think Billy will have these posted within a day or so, right, Billy, on APA?
Okay. Thank you for your answer. I appreciate that. And so does the attendees. Okay. Can Matt talk about the difference between the basic and enhanced commissioning, the pros and cons of it?
Sure thing. Great question. So I'm going to assume this question means as the LEED rating system sort of defines it. So basic commissioning is a prerequisite of the LEED rating system, and you basically have to do it if your building is going to be certified at any level of LEED. Enhanced commissioning gets you 3 points within the LEED rating system, so that starts working you towards your silver or your gold or your certified rating, whatever it might be. The additional things you have to do to go from basic commissioning to enhanced commissioning, you need to be engaged longer in the process. There is a seasonal aspect to it, right? Traditional commissioning, if you just want to get the prerequisite, would end at the end of construction. If you want to get those extra 3 points, you need to be engaged through that first year of warranty, like we talked about here, which I think is generally a pretty good idea. There's also some other documentation style things, like you need to provide a systems manual and you need to provide additional oversight on some of the other turnover documents. I think if I was, to be in charge of a budget tomorrow, of those extra things that you get with enhanced commissioning, honestly, the systems manual is a super useful document if it's done properly. And the way I like to characterize that is everybody's, bought a car or bought a refrigerator, and you get handed, this hundreds of pages long user's manual that has everything you'd ever need to know about that at an excruciating level of detail. And while that's important and your construction professional is going to provide that for you, the systems manual is sort of like that other piece of paper in the package, which is the quick start guide. How do I get this going? How do I get my Bluetooth connected to my radio? And how do I make some ice for later? Just the quick, fast answer questions. And I think that systems manual, when it's developed properly, is sort of a version of that for your building.
Okay, thank you. My next question is, I just lost it, sorry. I had asked for the quality verification actions diagram be included in a CX plan, or is it more for internal use?
I think it should be included in the plan. I think that communicating out what that plan looks like, the diagram, what the steps are, is super important, because generally what we'll find is we'll have a detailed meeting about something, and then maybe that particular activity doesn't come up for a few months during a project, and somebody will need to remind themselves and go back to it, and they can be, oh, that's right, we put that in the commissioning plan. I can just pop that open and take a look at it. So I'd advocate for anything like that to be front and center and available for the team whenever they want it.
Okay. And our next question is, in your experience, what are the most important components of Envelope CX? Our budgets don't usually support Envelope CX, and it can really vary in scope.
Yep, great question. It's got to be the roof, I think. A roof can make or break a building for its entire life if it's well put in. I think, putting that roof on properly in the first place, and then making sure that you're set up 20 years down the road for that first re-roof. I think thinking about stuff like that on the front end is just invaluable and really can extend the life of a building.
Okay. What is the best method of hiring a commissioning agent? Owner direct, through AE? What conflicts of interest are with each, or any of them?
Yeah, I think I don't know of a conflict of having a commissioning agent work directly for the owner. So I'll say that first. I think that that's just ideal. It really helps the owner effectively promote whatever it is their version of successful looks like. It certainly is becoming more acceptable to at least contract, the commissioning agent under the AE. That's going to be acceptable in the next version of the lead rating system. And maybe even having them be part of the team, it sort of just depends. If the owner has a ton of trust in their AE and they believe that they can act independently, then that's great. But, it definitely, I think somebody could see where if you have, a mechanical engineer who's a designer working for the same firm. Sorry, there's an echo. If somebody wouldn't mind muting, thank you. If you have a mechanical engineer who's working for a design firm, and then, across the hall is the commissioning department, those folks work for the same company and have the same incentive and some duty to not only support their owner, but also make their company, improve their reputation in the marketplace, and, also make the company profitable. There could potentially be some situation where, the commissioning agent notices something in a design review that might cause the engineer more effort or redesign or more of their time on site, to go back and forth between the two, and sort of there could be an incentive there to work something out. Now, I don't think that happens very often. I think the risk of that is generally low because most people are very ethical in this industry, you know what I mean? But there is an incentive there for it. And I think anytime that an owner is left out of the loop with the intention of not giving clear communication on what's going on in their project, I think that should be managed.
All right, thank you very much. Our next question, for monitor-based commissioning, are there specific programs that would facilitate this process, or would this be done by BMS trends?
So monitoring based does use BMS trends, but there is usually another layer of software on top of that takes those trends and then makes things called rules, which spit out more common sense troubleshooting type things. The example might be on your BAS today, maybe you get an alarm that says temperature in room 100 is too high. Okay, well, that's true, but that doesn't really tell you much about why that might be happening. A monitoring based rule might spit out something like they would look at that temperature and say, well, that's high, but also we noticed this valve is commanded to 100%, but is actually at 0. So, all right, these two things are happening. And here's a rule that says, hey, go check the cooling coil valve. It might be stuck. So it is typically best applied by some kind of third-party software provider that usually runs cloud-based algorithms using the BMS data that's already on your system.
Okay, our next question is, I've heard the term system effect. Is this a common term? If so, can you further define or describe it?
I haven't heard that term. I don't know. I haven't heard it in any context. If I had to guess at it, I would say There's a difference between a piece of equipment operating correctly and an entire system operating correctly, which has a lot of pieces of equipment in it. And we can get into this if this is useful, but that's usually where we draw the line between a functional performance test versus an integrated systems test.
Okay. We have another question that I think is best answered directly by you to the person asking it. So I'll send that over to you so you can answer that. So that looks like we are at the end of our questions for this time period anyway. So Cale and David and Kelly, thank you so much for taking time to put this together. And we appreciate all that you do and being a partner with APA. So thank you very much. And to our attendees, thank you for taking time out of your extremely busy schedules to be with us. So until next time, be safe, stay healthy, and you hear me say this all the time. Let's be kind to one another. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Billy.